Diane Foster needed nothing that night except a ride home. Her company sedan had died in the middle of a mountain rainstorm, and the only man who stopped was me, a widowed father driving a beat-up old SUV. She looked at my truck the way someone looks at a junkyard. For 45 miles, she took small, precise jabs at my job, my truck, my whole ordinary life. Then a fallen tree branch forced me to slam the brakes, and a stuffed bear rolled out from under the back seat. Diane went pale. She recognized that silver thread stitched into its ear. She'd sewn it herself years ago. If you like stories where arrogance finally comes due, subscribe and stick with me, because the next turn cuts even deeper than the first. The testing facility sits alone in the Vermont mountains, 11 miles past the last gas station. Foster Aerospace had just wrapped a private evaluation on a new aircraft frame, the kind of program a company builds the next 20 years of its future around, and the whole building still carried that particular smell of ozone and machine coolant that follows a long test run. Outside, the weather had gone from bad to dangerous in about 40 minutes. The helicopter meant to fly Diane Foster off that ridge was chained to the pad, rotors drooping under the downpour, and nobody in a flight suit was going to argue with a ceiling that low. The company sedan came up the access road to collect her, a long black machine with $112,000 of engineering under the hood, and it made it exactly to the second gate before its electrical system quietly died. Diane stood under the overhang, arms crossed, coat somehow still bone dry, phone pressed to her ear, and every inch of her posture said this delay was a personal insult that someone would answer for. She had a board reading the next morning at 9, 4 hours south, and that meeting would decide whether the program she'd staked her career on moved into production. I was loading my own truck when Robert Hayes found me. Robert was the board chairman, standing in the rain looking for a ride himself. My truck is an SUV from the 90s with 260,000 miles on it, a crack across the windshield, and a maintenance log I keep by hand in a notebook in the glove box because I do all the work myself. I had on a work coat, jeans, and boots with a fresh streak of gear oil across one toe because that afternoon I'd climbed down into the test cell myself to inspect a component cluster the data had made me suspicious of. Robert looked at me, then at the dead sedan, then at Diane, and settled the whole thing in one sentence. I was headed right past her neighborhood so I could drop her home. Diane crossed the wet pavement with an assistant holding an umbrella over her, and she stopped 6 feet from my truck, looking at it the way a surgeon looks at an infected wound. She didn't ask my name. She didn't ask what I did there. She asked whether the thing would actually survive 40 miles, with zero humor in the question. I told her it had never once left me stranded. She climbed in the way someone climbs into transportation beneath their station, gathering her coat close so it wouldn't touch anything. I closed the door for her because my wife raised me better than the moment deserved.
Here's what she didn't know as I pulled through the gate. I already knew exactly who she was. I'd known her face for 11 years from photographs my wife kept in a shoebox and looked at maybe twice a year. Always late at night, always alone at the kitchen table, always put away again without a word. I said none of that. I understood with a strange kind of calm that I was sitting less than a yard from the woman who had cut my wife out of her life like a name crossed off a list. The rain thickened around mile 4, the kind that turns headlights into 2 smeared cones and makes 40 miles an hour feel reckless. A closed vehicle is a confessional, and it's also an arena. Diane treated it like the second one. Somewhere around mile 10, her eyes started cataloging the inside of my truck, and I felt the conversation shift before she even opened her mouth. She spotted the small insulated lunchbox behind my seat and a kid's fleece jacket folded on the bench with a hair tie sitting on top. She asked if I had children. I told her I had a daughter. That was the whole answer. No name, no age, no photo, because a man learns fast which parts of his life are safe to hand over. She asked where the mother was. When I said nothing, she took my silence as confirmation of whatever story she'd already written, and her voice softened into something worse than contempt, sympathy aimed just slightly past the actual person. She told me it was admirable what men like me managed with what little we had. Then she started explaining me to myself. She figured I'd chosen contract work for the flexibility, since a man in my circumstances could hardly compete for jobs that demanded real hours and real travel. She said the industry was full of capable hands who plateaued because they never learned to think past the part in front of them. When I mentioned my work was on the engineering side, she gave a short laugh with no warmth in it and said good technicians often mistake fixing machines for understanding how to run a company. I kept my eyes on the road and let her keep talking, because in my experience, people reveal themselves fastest when nobody interrupts. She talked about scale, the favorite subject of people who confuse it with importance. She managed 11,000 employees across 4 states. She'd approved decisions worth $240 million in a single afternoon. She recited all of it to a stranger in a work coat like she was reading me her resume. Then, because I'm not made of stone, I asked her one question. Did she actually believe the system we'd tested that week was ready? The temperature in the cab dropped 10 degrees. She didn't answer the question. She answered the fact that a man in a work coat had asked it. She told me a person in my position looks at one bolt, while a person in her position has to look at an entire company, spacing the words out like she was talking to a child who'd interrupted the adults. I told her sometimes one bolt is exactly what stops the whole company. She laughed, a short dismissive breath through her nose, and turned to stare out the window. Remember both of those lines, because in about 14 hours, one of them was going to be repeated in a room with 12 people in it, and it wasn't going to be mine.
2 miles from her gate, she opened her purse, pulled out 3 folded bills, and set them on the dashboard next to the vent, saying, "For gas, the way you'd tip a valet you'll never see again." I picked them up and handed them straight back, without slowing down. She held them a second, and I watched her recalibrate, decided what she'd just witnessed was wounded pride from a poor man, something she knew how to fix. She told me I shouldn't turn my pride into an expense my kid would end up paying. That sentence went into me like a splinter. I didn't respond for 4 or 5 seconds. I've never found raised voices useful. I took the bills from her hand, reached over and tucked them into the outer pocket of her coat, saying nothing while I did it. The silence that followed was the first silence in 40 minutes she hadn't filled. She stared straight ahead, jaw locked. The road narrowed where the pines crowd in before the turn toward the old estates, pavement dark, slick, littered from the wind, and I saw the branch about half a second before my headlights caught its full length across my lane. I braked hard and steady, and behind me something slid out from under the back seat, hit the console, and dropped into the footwell between us. A bear, cream-colored, worn down at the paws to the gray of an old dish towel, body gone soft and lopsided from 30 years of being held. One ear had a seam running across it, closed with silver thread, 6 uneven stitches, the kind of repair made by someone who owned a sewing kit but not the patience for one. Its left eye was a dark blue button, a size too small for the socket, sitting slightly higher than the right. Diane leaned forward to pick it up on pure reflex, the way anyone would, and her hand stopped 4 inches above it and simply stayed there. She didn't move for a long time. I knew exactly what she was seeing. 25 years earlier, a family dog had nearly torn that ear off. There was no matching thread in the house that night, and a little girl was crying, so Diane Foster sat down on a hallway floor with a silver spool from a hem repair kit and stitched the ear back on herself. She'd replaced the missing eye a week later with a button pulled off one of her own blouses, dark blue, slightly too small, and never bothered fixing the height. There is no second bear anywhere with that ear, that thread, that button. Diane knew it before her hand ever came down. She whispered a name. Sarah. Just that, barely audible over the rain. My hands tightened on the wheel without my deciding to. She turned in her seat and actually looked at me for the first time in 43 miles, and her voice came out stripped of all the architecture it had carried all night. She asked where I'd gotten it. I didn't answer right away. I was doing the math on what the next 4 minutes would cost both of us, and my silence lit a fuse. Panic doesn't stay panic in someone like Diane. It converts. She started building a case out loud at speed. Maybe I'd bought it at an estate sale. Maybe it came from a storage unit. Then she landed on the accusation she really wanted, asking if I'd ever had contact with her daughter. And something in how she said the word daughter told me she hadn't spoken it out loud in a very long time. I found a gravel turnout past the branch, pulled off and put the truck in park. Rain hammered the roof like gravel dropped from a height. I turned to face her and said it as plainly as I know how. Sarah gave that bear to my daughter. Diane didn't move. Her hand was still half raised over it, and I watched her try to fit that sentence into any shape she could hold on to. She demanded to know why my daughter had her daughter's belongings, asking it like a prosecutor. So I closed the gap for her. I told her Lily is also Sarah's daughter. The quiet that followed had texture. Rain, the engine ticking as it cooled, the turn signal I'd forgotten to cancel. Diane's eyes moved across my face, down to the bear, back up, and she said nothing. I told her Sarah was my wife. Then I sat there and let her be the first person in that truck to actually breathe. She didn't believe me. Not out of stubbornness, not entirely. It was the only structural support she had left. She remembered there'd been a man once, years back, someone she'd decided was beneath her family without ever sitting in a room with him. She'd never learned my name. She'd made a point of never learning it, because a name makes a person real, and she needed me to stay a category. She ended the argument the way she ended every argument, telling her only daughter that if she walked out of the foster house to be with that man, she shouldn't plan on coming back. Sarah walked. She left with 2 suitcases, a shoebox, and that bear, and she married me 9 weeks later in front of a clerk at a small-town courthouse with 2 strangers as witnesses, wearing a plain $60 dress off a rack because she said she was done wearing things that came with conditions. Diane, sitting in my truck 25 miles from that courthouse, told me what she'd believed at the time, that Sarah would be back within 4 months, that hardship was a teacher working in her favor. Sarah never came back, and Diane never went looking. When I asked why, she gave me the only honest answer she offered all night. Going to look would have meant admitting she'd been wrong. So I told her the rest. I told her Sarah died 2 years earlier, that spring, after being sick for a while. I didn't describe the illness or the room. Diane's mouth opened slightly and no sound came out. I gave her the 3 sentences I'd carried up that mountain, never expecting to actually say them. You didn't know she was married. You didn't know she had a child. You didn't know she was gone. Diane looked down at the bear on the floor of my truck, at the silver thread her own hands had sewn when she was younger than I am now, and I watched a woman who managed 11,000 people discover she had no procedure for this. I put the truck back in gear because we were still 9 minutes from her gate and nothing left to say would survive being rushed. Just before the final turn, because she'd earned the whole truth and not a comfortable slice of it, I told her Sarah had tried to tell her all of this herself more than once. The Foster estate has a stone gate and gravel drive that curves so you can't see the house from the road. I stopped at the gate rather than driving up to the door, and Diane didn't get out. She sat there with the engine running and asked for proof, and I respected that more than she expected, because a woman being handed a grandchild by a stranger in a rainstorm should ask for proof. I pulled up one photo on my phone and turned the screen toward her. Sarah, in that $60 dress on the courthouse steps, squinting, laughing at something off camera, her hand flat against my chest. That's all I showed her. Nothing of Lily, not a single frame, because my daughter wasn't going to become evidence in a family argument she never agreed to join. Diane stared at that photo a long time. Then instinct clawed its way back up through the grief, and she started asking the wrong questions. What had Sarah left behind? What I was after? How much? Why was I surfacing now, this particular month, with the company's biggest program, one vote from production? Whether I planned to use a 7-year-old to stake a claim on the Foster estate? That was the first moment all night my face went cold, and she saw it happen. I told her Sarah never took another dollar from anything with the Foster name on it after the day she left. Not a check, not tuition, not a wedding gift. And that she'd been quietly proud of that, with no spite behind it at all. I told her I had no interest in her estate and even less in her name. Diane, unable to help herself, gave a thin smile and said, "Everyone needs money, and the only difference between people is the number." So I gave her the sentence I'd been carrying for 11 years without realizing it. That's exactly why Sarah never came home. She got out. I waited until the gate closed behind her, then drove the last 12 minutes to a house with one porch light burning. I carried a sleeping child up the stairs and tucked a stuffed bear into the crook of her arm, then sat on the hallway floor for a while in the dark. What happened inside that stone house I learned later, in pieces, some from Diane herself, some from the woman who'd run that household for 26 years. Diane walked into 11,000 square feet of paid-for silence, and for the first time in her adult life felt no power in it at all. She stood in the front hall, coat still on, rain still in her hair, and asked the housekeeper whether any letters had ever come from her daughter. The housekeeper didn't need to check. She'd been waiting 8 years to be asked that exact question, and answered by repeating an instruction Diane herself had given once, years earlier. All personal correspondence from Sarah goes straight to archive. It does not go on the desk. Diane had said it once, furious in about 4 seconds, and forgotten it completely, the way powerful people forget the small orders other people spend years obeying. The staff hadn't forgotten. One instruction spoken in anger had run uninterrupted for 8 years. They brought up a gray file box from the lower level, unremarkable, an inventory sticker on the lid, letters filed on edge in date order because someone cared enough to keep them that way. The first year's envelope said, "Mom." The second year, one said, "Mom, please read this." After that, the handwriting on the front turned formal and careful and terrible, and every envelope for the next 6 years was addressed to Diane Foster, like she was a company. Diane sat down on the floor of her own study in a suit worth more than my truck and opened the top one. Sarah had written that she was married, plainly, happily, and that she hoped someday her mother would want to meet the man in the enclosed photograph. The photo was still inside. The second letter, 4 months later, said she was pregnant. Diane didn't open the third. She sat there with 2 pages in her hands, looked at the postmark on the second envelope, and did the arithmetic anyone can do without wanting to. It came out to nearly 8 years. At the bottom of the box, on top of the last envelope, the handwriting was thinner, slower, wrong, dated less than a year before her daughter died. She was at headquarters by 7 the next morning. I know because I was there at 6:40 and her car already sat in the executive level of the garage. The woman who stepped out of the elevator on the 11th floor hadn't slept. You wouldn't have known it from a distance. Flawless charcoal suit, hair exact, moving through the lobby like weather moving through a valley. 3 people changed direction to avoid her. She walked into the boardroom at 8:59 and sat at the head of the table like the previous night had happened to someone else. The meeting had one purpose: deciding whether the new airframe moved into production tooling, the point in any program where money stops being a plan and becomes a factory. Diane wanted approval that morning, and she wasn't wrong about the stakes. A 6-month delay on a program that size costs 8 figures and strains relationships with 3 governments. Robert Hayes let her finish, then said the independent reliability assessment was complete and the assessor would present in person. He asked the assistant at the door to bring him in. I walked in. No work coat, no gear oil, no jeans, no expensive suit either. I've never found a good suit makes a bad finding easier to swallow. Pressed shirt, plain navy blazer, a folder, a laptop with a cracked corner. Diane's hand froze halfway to her water glass. I took the empty seat at the far end of the table, 19 feet of polished walnut between us, and said good morning to the room like a man with work to do. Robert made the introduction, and I watched it land on her one clause at a time. Dr. Ryan Cole, Independent Reliability Engineering Specialist, retained directly by the board 6 months earlier, reporting to the board, not the executive team. Diane's eyes dropped to my folder, then to the name printed at every place setting, and I watched her place it in her memory, because the name on all that correspondence had always been abbreviated, R. Cole. It had crossed her desk maybe 40 times over 6 months, in scheduling notes and access approvals, and one billing summary she'd personally initialed, and she'd never once been curious enough to ask what the person behind those letters looked like. Here's what she learned about me in the next 90 seconds, in front of 12 people. That I wasn't a maintenance technician, that I'd spent 14 years consulting on flight-critical systems for programs considerably larger than hers, including 2 she'd competed against and lost, that an analysis framework I built in my 30s was now used by 4 manufacturers on 3 continents to model how small failures cascade into large ones, and that the board had specifically requested me for one reason, Robert stated plainly. I had documented history of not bending my findings when a chief executive leaned on me. Diane isn't slow, and she isn't a coward. She counterattacked within 10 seconds, informing the board that the assessor had a personal relationship with the chief executive's family, an obvious conflict of interest, and any finding in that folder was compromised. It was the right move. In most rooms, it would have worked. Laura Simmons, the board's counsel, didn't even look up. She slid a single document to the center of the table and let it sit. My disclosure, signed and dated 11 days before I ever signed the engagement contract. In it, I'd declared everything in writing, that I'd been married to Sarah Foster, formerly an engineer at the company, the chief executive's daughter, that she died 2 years earlier, that we had a child, that I held intellectual property jointly developed with her. The board had reviewed all of it, gotten an outside opinion, imposed reporting terms routing every draft of my work through counsel instead of the executive suite, and hired me anyway, on purpose, eyes open. One more line, and Laura read it aloud in the same tone she'd use for a parking allowance. The details of the disclosure had been withheld from the chief executive specifically because the chief executive was the party capable of creating the conflict. Diane sat very still. I didn't win that room by ambushing her. I won it because 11 days before any money was on the table, I'd written down the one fact that could have disqualified me, handed it to the people with the authority to disqualify me, and let them decide. Then I presented. It took 19 minutes and wasn't dramatic. I'd found an error in the thermal control logic governing a secondary bleed path, a fault that surfaces in roughly one duty cycle out of 4,000 under a narrow combination of altitude, ambient temperature, and power draw. On a test rig, it looks like nothing. It looks like noise. But the path sits on structure that's bonded, not bolted, and bonded structure can't be revised after tooling without redesigning everything around it. Meaning if this surfaced in year 3 of production instead of that morning, the company would be facing a recall on every delivered airframe and a 2-year redesign of the center section. David Reynolds, the engineering director, said quietly from the middle of the table that his team had flagged the same region 11 months ago and been told to keep to schedule. Nobody asked who'd given that direction. I watched Diane's face as the room went silent, and I knew exactly which sentence was running behind her eyes because it had been said to her in the dark on a wet road 14 hours earlier by a man she thought fixed things for a living. Sometimes one bolt is the thing that stops the entire company. Robert asked the only question that mattered. Was there a fix that didn't cost 2 years? I told him yes, that a workable architecture had existed for 10 years, developed inside that building by an engineer who no longer worked there. Then I said her name, Sarah Foster. 11 years earlier, Sarah had proposed a different approach to thermal protection on a smaller program, redundant passive margin instead of tighter active control, arguing it would cost 8 months up front and save a decade of exposure. The company went the other way. I know exactly why, and so did the woman at the head of the table, because Diane had been the one to reject it, writing 2 words in the margin of the review that David Reynolds had kept a copy of for 11 years, too conservative. Sarah was 29, the chief executive's daughter, and every engineer in that building assumed she'd been overruled for the second reason rather than the first, its own kind of damage. She left the company 14 months later. She didn't stop working on it. That's the part I'd want anyone to understand about my wife. She kept developing that architecture at a kitchen table in a rented house, and I did the reliability modeling because that's what I'm good at, and she did the physics because she was better than me at that. It was never revenge. She believed the design was better and wanted it to exist in the world whether or not her name ever ended up on it. She used to say, a good idea doesn't care who's holding it. We filed jointly 4 patents, 2 continuations, all clean, all documented, all hers as much as mine. When Sarah died, her half didn't come to me. It went into a trust set up while she was still well enough to sign her name clearly, with one beneficiary, Lily Cole, age 7, 90 miles away in a second-grade classroom, drawing a picture of a horse. So here was the position the room found itself in. The only architecture that could save the company's biggest program in under 2 years couldn't be licensed without agreement from 2 parties, me and a trust belonging to the granddaughter Diane Foster had learned existed the night before. She fought it. Of course she fought it, and the only way she knew how, by making an offer right there in front of the board. An executive vice presidency for me, a technical division of my choosing, a consulting rate 4 times my current one. options vesting over 5 years, a fully funded education trust for Lily through graduate school, and an outright buyout of the intellectual property at a number she named without consulting her CFO, because she'd already decided everything in that room was purchasable and simply mispriced. I declined to combine my family with a transaction and said it in those exact words. Diane's control broke for the first time in public, her voice rising as she accused me of holding her company hostage. I said no. I was asking her company to fix the thing her own engineers had warned her about 11 months earlier and been told to route around. Robert Hayes, who'd said almost nothing for an hour, said the board would follow the technical process, and the way he said process closed the subject. Then I gave them the part nobody expected, the actual reason I'd come. I offered to license the architecture non-exclusively at a rate I'd put in writing that afternoon, fair market, third-party comparable, no premium for leverage, no penalty for history. I wasn't there to break Foster Aerospace. 11,000 people worked there, 4 of whom had personally called me after Sarah died, one of whom still sends my daughter a birthday card. I had one condition, and it wasn't financial. An independent review, run by people the executive suite didn't select, into the pattern of engineering warnings that had been overridden for schedule on this program and the 2 before it. I didn't want her money. I never wanted her money, and I think that was the hardest thing about me for her to process. She had a category for men who wanted money, and a category for men who pretended not to want it, and no third category. What I wanted was for the system to change, so the next 29-year-old engineer who's right in that building doesn't have to leave it to find out. Every measurement Diane had taken of me in that truck, every conclusion, every cruel and kind assumption about a man with a lunchbox behind his seat came apart in one sentence. Before I picked up my folder and left, I gave them the last thing I'd brought with me, something Sarah told me once at that kitchen table. Her mother would only ever learn the value of a thing after it stopped being for sale.
That night, Diane read every letter. She told me later it took until nearly 4 in the morning. Sarah married, Sarah pregnant, then Sarah a mother with a name and a weight and a date. Sarah listing her address plainly twice at the bottom of a page, like an open invitation. Then the later ones, Sarah asking her mother to call, just once, on any day for any reason, and saying she wouldn't ask again. Sarah mentioning she was sick in one paragraph without drama. And the last one, in that thin, slow handwriting, where my wife told her mother she was no longer waiting for an apology, and had stopped expecting one, and that the only thing she still hoped for was that if Diane ever met the girl, she wouldn't treat Lily the way she'd treated the man Lily's mother chose. That letter had been sitting in a gray box 11 feet below a kitchen where Diane ate breakfast every morning for 2.5 years. And here's the blow that actually landed, the one Diane said out loud to me later, with no defense in front of it at all. Nobody had hidden Sarah from her. The address was right there in the box. The company had a security department that could locate a person in an afternoon. She could have found her daughter on any one of nearly 3,000 days. She simply never looked. She showed up at my house that Saturday. No company car, no assistant, no driver at the curb, just a rental sedan parked crooked at the bottom of my driveway, and a woman in flat shoes who clearly hadn't chosen flat shoes in years. I didn't invite her in. Lily was at a birthday party 4 streets over, due back at 2, and I told Diane that, and told her whether she was still standing in my yard at 2 would depend entirely on the next 15 minutes. She nodded, then started in, and within a minute I knew the letters had cracked her, but hadn't yet changed her. She talked about a private school 40 minutes away, a trust structure her attorneys could draft up by Wednesday, a better house in a better district. She was building the whole thing at speed, the same way she'd built the boardroom offer, genuinely believing she was being generous. I let her finish, then said the only thing that was actually going to land, quietly, standing on my own steps with my hands in my pockets. "You're bidding again." She didn't understand. She genuinely didn't, and that was somehow the saddest part of the whole morning. So I spelled it out. She'd once tried to buy Sarah away from me with a house and a name and a life, and when the price failed, she'd withdrawn the offer and called it a decision. Now she was standing in my driveway trying to buy her way into my daughter's life with tuition and a trust, because it was the only language she'd ever bothered learning fluently. She started to answer, stopped, hand rising to her mouth, and stood there staring at the hedge like it had said something back to her. So I set the terms. Diane doesn't get access to Lily on the basis of blood, because blood isn't a credential, and my daughter isn't a foster asset waiting to be recovered. She doesn't get to enter that child's life as a rescue. If a day ever comes when Lily meets her, it'll be because Diane has proven over time that she doesn't get to choose it, that she's capable of entering someone's life without trying to run it. Diane Foster, who had a prepared answer for everything, stood in front of me with nothing at all. She said, "All right." 2 words, no counteroffer. I believe that was her first honest negotiation of her life. Before she left, I went inside and came back out with the bear. I hadn't planned it. Lily had left it on the arm of the couch that morning because a birthday party is a place you bring a bear to lose. I held it out. Diane raised her hand toward it and stopped exactly the way she had on the floor of my truck, 4 inches short. Then she asked a question that was itself the whole story of the change beginning. "May I hold it?" I said yes. She took it in both hands, turned it over, found the ear with her thumb, 6 uneven stitches in silver thread, sewn on a hallway floor 25 years earlier for a crying girl who grew up to be an engineer, a wife, a mother, and then a name on a stone. She didn't cry the way people cry in movies. Her face barely moved. She held that bear for about 30 seconds, and I watched a woman understand that for 8 years, the closest thing to her daughter had been a piece of stuffed fabric she'd repaired badly and then forgotten. She handed it back, thanked me, and drove away without asking for anything else. The board reconvened 11 days later, and the mood in the building was ugly because delay is a word that costs people their bonuses. 3 members spent the week arguing the finding was marginal, the exposure theoretical, that the company should proceed to tooling and handle the thermal path in a later production block. 2 wanted Diane to push it through on her own authority, which she had, and everyone in the room knew the numbers favored her if she used it. I sat at the far end again with my folder, braced to lose. Diane stood up, and then she did the thing I hadn't seen coming. She told the board the engineers had warned her. She said it without cushioning, that she'd prioritized an announcement window over an engineering process more than once. She recommended the delay herself on the record and asked that her recommendation be minuted in exactly those words. Then she made one more request that stopped the room cold, that the design about to be licensed be credited in the engineering record under its author's full name, Sarah Foster Cole, not Sarah Foster. She was specific about it, and I understood exactly what she was giving up. For a woman like her, that hyphenated surname was a public admission her daughter had married a man she'd refused to meet and died carrying his name.
She could have kept the family line clean. Instead, she put my wife's whole name into a technical archive that will outlast everyone at that table. Then she signed the licensing agreement at the ordinary rate I'd proposed. No family provisions attached, no visitation language, no trust beneficiary, no school, no granddaughter mentioned anywhere. Clean commercial paper. I read every line twice, looking for the hook. There wasn't one. The board did the rest. They chartered an independent technical committee with authority to halt any program milestone on safety grounds, reporting directly to the board. Diane kept her title, her office, her salary. What she lost was the thing she'd actually been protecting for 11 years, the ability to override a safety judgment single-handedly, in hallway, in 4 seconds, the same way she'd once ordered a daughter's letters into a basement. Nobody fired her, no walk to the elevator with a box, no farewell speech, no security escort, because real consequences are almost never theatrical. She simply came to work the following Monday as a chief executive whose word was no longer final on the one subject that had ever actually mattered.
She caught up with me in the corridor after the boardroom. She didn't ask to meet Lily. She didn't ask when she'd be forgiven or whether she would be or what she could do to speed it along. The absence of those questions told me more than any speech could have. She said 5 words. You were right about me. I told her Sarah had been right about her too, and that she'd refused to listen. Then I said goodbye and walked to the parking garage, because there was nothing else true left to say, and I've never seen the point in saying anything else. 4 months later, the program went back into flight testing with the new thermal architecture, 8 months behind the original schedule and considerably harder to break. I'm still the independent assessor. I turned down the vice presidency twice in writing, and turned down the consulting rate too, because the value of what I do collapses the moment I start getting paid by the people I'm checking on. My daughter still goes to the same school in the same district. The roof on our house is still bad. In that stretch of time, Diane Foster did exactly one thing, over and over, without being asked. She wrote letters to Lily, addressed to my house, roughly 1 every 2 weeks, and not one of them contained a check, a gift card, a toy, a brochure, or an invitation. She wrote about weather, about a dog she had as a girl, about the first airplane she ever flew in, about a woman named Sarah who once took a clock apart at 11 years old and got it back together with 2 pieces left over. She never once asked to visit. I read every letter before Lily saw any of them, then kept them in the kitchen drawer and told my daughter they were there, that they were hers, that she could read them or not read them or burn them in the yard, and nobody in the world would be angry at her either way. It took 9 months. Then one evening she asked me what a grandmother was supposed to be like. I told her the truth, that nobody really knows, and that people have to show you. They met on a Saturday in October at a small place beside the lake with 6 tables and a window that fogs. Diane got there first, which I noticed, and came alone, which I noticed even more. No assistant, no driver, no car with a company plate. She'd left the rental in the public lot up the hill and walked down in a plain coat. Lily and I arrived 11 minutes late because we'd had a debate in the parking lot about whether the bear was coming. The bear won. I didn't coach my daughter. I didn't tell her what to call anyone. I didn't tell her what had happened in a truck on a mountain road 2 years earlier, because that's a story for someone older than 8. Lily carried the bear in the crook of her elbow the way she has since she was 5. Diane looked at the bear before she looked at the child, and I watched her make herself stop doing that. We sat down, a long moment where nobody had anything to say. Then my daughter, who is not shy and never has been,
set the bear on the table between them, and asked the question she'd apparently been saving for 9 months, whether Diane was the one who'd sewn the ear. Diane looked at the 6 uneven stitches, more than 30 years old now, gone gray with washing, and said yes. Lily turned the ear over, examined it with the terrible fairness of a second grader, and delivered her verdict. Diane had sewn it badly. I laughed before I could stop myself, and then Diane Foster laughed too, out loud, shoulders down, hand over her eyes, in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with being anybody's chief executive.
Nothing was forgiven at that table. My daughter didn't call her grandmother that day, or for a long while after, and Diane didn't ask her to. There was no reunion, no speech, because the past doesn't dissolve, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. 3 people ate lunch beside a lake in October and talked about a horse Lily isn't allowed to have. On the empty chair between Diane and me sat an old cream-colored bear with one blue button eye, the same bear that had once rolled out from under the back seat of a truck she thought belonged to a man beneath her notice. Diane once believed power meant never having to ask anyone's permission. But on the day my daughter set that bear down in her hands and told her the stitching was crooked, she finally understood something. The things most worth keeping in this life never belong to the people who take them. They belong to the ones patient enough to be handed them.